Thank you for tuning into the European Guanxi podcast. Together, we bring scholars, academics, and experts to talk about the evolving relations of Europe and China's foreign policy. Today, I'm at Institut Montaigne with Mathieu Duchâtel. Thank you for being here. And we're going to explore Asia and Europe's security concerns at the moment. So first of all, I'd like to know how you got interested about China and Europe's foreign security, and what is your role as the director of the Asia program here, and overall the objective of this independent think tank here in France.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be on your program. So what got me interested in China initially was actually language. So I started learning Chinese language when I was 18. And at Sciences Po, I had the opportunity to join a master's program that was focused on international relations. And at the time, the topic I picked was the security situation in the Taiwan Strait, and more specifically, the democratization of national security policy making in Taiwan, which gave me the opportunity to actually spend a long time in Taiwan for my research, because this project developed into a PhD dissertation. And I think, interestingly, when I came back to France after this long period of 4 years studying in Taiwan, I was offered an opportunity to work in a think tank, and I was told Asia Centre, which still exists today and is one of the leading French think tank working on Asian public policy issues. And I was told that there was enormous interest in Chinese foreign policy, so that I would have the job, but that my focus would have to be Chinese foreign policy, which I found immensely interesting and challenging. So I took the opportunity and then developed my career into think tanks for quite a long time. And at Institut Montaigne, the Asia program was created in 2019. And I think it's interesting to note that for a French think tank that initially was, when it was founded, entirely focused on domestic issues in France, and then decided to kind of grow into international issues. This decision to create an Asia program came before any decision to create, let's say, a Middle East program or an Africa program or, a Russia program. And I think the idea of the leadership at the Institute was that trends occurring in Asia have a major impact on public policies in France and in Europe. And so that's really how we picked our topic at the Institute. We do not cover everything. That's impossible, of course, for any organization. But we pick the issues emerging from China, but also from India, Japan, Taiwan, some other countries in the region that have the most impact on France and the EU level. So in the end, what we study is always the policy impact for France and Europe.
And you said you had a very international experience. You both worked and conducted research in France and in Taiwan and China. I was wondering if you encountered any differences in how these countries approach the topic of security.
Well, very much. Actually, I think the most interesting development over a period of, let's say, 20 years, and you ask me about Taiwan and European countries, is this development of an economic security dimension in national security. When I was working in Taiwan, and that was between 2003 and 2007, this element of economic security was already very present in the security thinking in Taiwan, because China at the time was extremely attractive for Taiwanese entrepreneurs. Cross-strait trade was booming. Taiwanese investment in mainland China was also booming, and the Taiwanese government had to make a major strategic decision regarding what they did with technology hollowing out, especially for semiconductors. And at the time, so there was a major strategic policy conference in Taiwan reuniting policymakers and key private sector leaders, and to solve that problem. What do we do with companies that want to produce in China to take advantage of cost and infrastructure, but that risk taking with them the best Taiwanese technology? And at the time, the Taiwanese decision was that, at least for the semiconductor industry, that the most advanced generation would stay in Taiwan, that Taiwan would maintain 2 generations of advance for semiconductor manufacturing, and also that the volume would stay in Taiwan. Fast forward to now in Europe, I think these questions of economic security were completely absent from the development of the EU-China trade and investment relationship until, let's say, 2016, 2017. That's when the question really came top of the agenda for French and European policymakers. So you could say that this economic security consideration that was always central to cross-strait relations emerged as a top priority for European policymakers as well, kind of later on.
Thank you. Well, thanks for giving us an international perspective. Now I'd like to shift towards more France-centered discussion. And I was wondering, how would you define France's strategic autonomy towards China? More than once, President Macron has proposed a narrative of wanting to restore France and Europe's global influence amid international competition. And do you think that France is actually able of having this strategic autonomy?
Well, strategic autonomy is a word, is an abstraction to a very large extent. And to me, it does not really describe well the key trends in France-China relations or in EU-China relations. I mean, clearly, this is a sort of aspiration for France and for the European Union. But if you look at the reality of the France-China relations, it's not the issue that dominate the relationship. I think the key 2 issues that dominate the France-China relationship, but also to some extent the EU-China relationship, is actually, number 1, the whole economic security agenda. First and foremost, the trade deficit, the asymmetry that is true for France, and that's at a much larger scale for the European Union. And I think if you look at the relationship over a period of 10 years, what is the most striking is the failure of both France and the European Union to rebalance the relationship. So that's priority number 1. And we have huge difficulties to solve that problem. This problem is unsolved. And the second one is more recent, and it's linked to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that is the critical support that China has been providing to the Russian efforts. First and foremost, the Russian arms industry through transfers of defense electronics. That is absolutely vital for the Russian arms industry. Secondly, the support for the Russian narrative that the invasion of Ukraine was actually provoked by NATO's expansion inside Ukraine, and that the Russian military operation is a legitimate response to that. I think the Chinese state has used these resources to promote that narrative in many countries, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and that matters for France and for the EU member states. And finally, because China provides a lifeline to the Russian economy. So if you watch what has been the French president's key messages to China in the past few years, since he resumed state-level, state visits to China, and it was in April 2023. I think those 2 issues have dominated the agenda, but it's been, extremely frustrating for him and for the European leaders because China has not moved.
Thank you for pinning down these two important points. And still on the note of France's role within China, do you think that the country can portray itself as a facilitator between the EU and China? And does it have the capabilities of being a mediator between the two? Or do you rather believe that there are some instances where it rather escalate the tension?
It's an interesting question because I think that the French President Macron has really tried to leverage his influence or personal charm to convince the Chinese leadership to change course over Russia and Ukraine, and this has not produced visible results. You may argue, if you are very, very optimistic and positive, that the only call that President Xi made to President Zelensky was after Macron's state visit in 2023. So maybe there's a link, but overall, it's been very difficult for France to move Chinese positions on anything, despite France and China being both on the Security Council of the UN, etc., etc. It's been frustrating. That's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is that France has also been, inside the EU, one of the leading advocates of a tougher approach on economic security matters. For example, France has been a leading advocate of initiating an anti-subsidies investigation into Chinese exports of electric vehicles to France, but has also been one of the leading voices to promote a stricter approach to foreign direct investment screening in Europe. It's not only about China, but it's a lot about China. So China is always looking for allies within the European Union that can help China kind of neutralize this economic security agenda. And I don't think that France has been very helpful in that regard.
You mentioned economic security a lot. And from your point of view, do you think that Beijing would benefit more from a different European Union governance of economic security to foster a more sustainable relationship in the future?
I have a strong opinion about this. I do think, and I'm very convinced, that China is actually extremely satisfied with the status quo in EU-China relations. The status quo for China means two things. First, it means continuous access to the EU single market with a huge trade surplus. Our deficit is China's surplus, and it's over 300 billion euros in 2025. So it's a major, major market for China. And despite everything we say about economic security, the trade relationship the exports, the Chinese exports to Europe have kept on growing in the past 5 years. That's the real story. And the Chinese look at the numbers and they see that on the one hand, we talk about economic security, we make use of our trade defense instruments, but the trade relationship keeps on growing to their advantage. So that's the first part of the status quo. So why change? I think they are very happy with this situation, especially as the US market is becoming problematic for their exporters. And the second element of the status quo is that, despite everything we say regarding the China-Russia strategic partnership, there is no cost to China's support for the Russian war effort. So the status quo is also, to a large extent, very beneficial to China. So, I think that when China looks at the relationship with the EU, their top goal is that it doesn't change.
Very interesting point. Thank you. Now moving on to your book, Géopolitique de la Chine, you explore the idea of China's selective international responsibilities. Could you please expand on that and tell us what are the circumstances where Beijing feels responsible for setting the global order, and whereas there are some other sectors in which it deliberately steps back?
Well, I think the whole, responsible stakeholder discussion that was dominating the discussion for a while regarding China, and that was really strong, let's say, during the Obama administration, to take a US reference point, also because there was a major push by the Obama administration to, work together with China to solve international problems. The very good example being Afghanistan. This discussion has now disappeared from the center stage. I think the dynamic in US-China competition and the US-China competition is really the defining relationship for the transformation of international relations, is no longer about finding areas to jointly improve global governance. It's no longer a US priority, and there's no longer external pressure to move China in that direction. So it seems to me that in recent years, and I hope I'll have the opportunity to update my book because there should be a fourth edition on that particular aspect. I think that China's foreign policy has been very much focused about, very hard objectives in terms of strategic positioning, and the whole global governance element is still present in the narrative. I mean, you have the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, but is really taking second row behind the very naked dynamic of US-China competition.
You mentioned global governance, and in this moment, I believe we're entering a phase of fractured global governance. China's foreign policy has been traditionally moved by the principle of non-interference. How do you think they are reframing this principle in this moment?
Yeah, so there was a period of time towards the end of the Hu Jintao era and the beginning of the Xi Jinping era, before COVID-19 and at the peak of the Belt and Road Initiative, when this logic of Chinese investment overseas and large-scale Chinese project overseas, bringing with them large numbers of Chinese workers and nationals, was transforming China's foreign and security policy in the sense of being more interventionist, because they had a stake in, let's say, Libya, 2011, the major evacuation from Libya. That was the very end of the Hu Jintao administration, involving the PLA. Basically, the PLA Navy was deployed in the Mediterranean to support the evacuation. Then the construction of the first Chinese naval base in Djibouti, that was 2014, 2015. And the linkage to the growth of Chinese overseas interest was pointing towards a very clear trend of deep Chinese involvement in dangerous places of the world that would justify intervening at some point when a crisis would happen, and China, just out of necessity, would have to intervene to protect their nationals and their assets. And I think the logic is still there, but the kind of trends has shifted, and especially 2025, 2026. I mean, you've seen Chinese interest in Venezuela, for example, being seriously damaged by the US interventionist policy, and China has not moved. You see in the Middle East that there are also questions regarding the future of Chinese interest, and you see China, and that's maybe an overly, short-term trend, but what is striking is China remaining in a position of, observing and being relatively passive.
Thank you. Still on this note of China's presence in other international conflicts, in your recent article, Japan, Taiwan, China's mobilization of the anti-fascist narrative, you claim that, and I quote, Beijing is gradually seeking to accustom the international community to the idea that various forms of force against Taiwan are legitimate and even lawful. So looking ahead, which forms of force do you think China is trying to pre-legitimatize? And how much do you think this justification of claims of legitimacy will uphold once the international tensions will escalate?
Yeah, well, in a way, seen from Beijing, the use of force is legitimate in the Taiwan Strait within Chinese one China principle. And I think that's been the narrative that China has been pushing to the international community forever regarding Taiwan. Any use of force would be a kind of law enforcement operation within one China, except that this narrative is not very convincing for the United States, Japan, but also, I would argue, most European countries, many countries in Southeast Asia. So there is a battle of narratives. And this battle of narratives has actually intensified after Ukraine, because China has noticed, and it's a fact, that the whole Western support for Ukraine has been premised on the UN Charter and the right of nations to defend themselves. So I think that China has been concerned that in a scenario of confrontation in the Taiwan Strait, some countries would find, arguments in international law to provide support to Taiwan based on this precedent, even though, it's difficult to compare, but these are hotspots and there are interesting links between the two. So I think that China is very actively promoting this narrative today. And I think it's quite concerning. And the short-term trend, meaning 2024, 2025, the past 2 years with the Light administration in Taiwan, has seen a Chinese policy that seeks to delegitimize the executive branch in Taiwan. And the context in Taiwan is favorable to that kind of policy because you have an executive power without a parliamentarian majority. So there is a very strong and vocal opposition in Taiwan, even though it's partly disorganized. But, so you have kind of voices that seek to delegitimize the executive branch in Taiwan inside Taiwan. So I think China is kind of doubling down on this effort to delegitimize the executive branch and to actually convey the signal to the international community that if anything happens in the Taiwan Strait, the Taiwanese themselves are responsible for that. It doesn't mean that they are intending to launch an invasion of Taiwan in the short term. It actually means something very different. It means two things. The first thing is that they are actively trying to influence the outcome of the 2028 election in Taiwan. That's the real priority. That's what matters most. That's what they are doing. And sometimes it's a bit confusing because you think that tensions are rising really high, but I think the ultimate aim of those tensions is the 2028 election in Taiwan. And the second thing that it means is that, overall, they are trying to win the competition for framing the Taiwan issue. And that's, I would say it's a never-ending game. So they will keep on pushing on that.
I'd like to shift our conversation to maritime power. And looking at China's navy is now one of the largest in the world by fleet size. Yet, as we know, numbers doesn't necessarily equal maritime power. And in terms of experience, technology, and operational reach, how close is China in actually achieving a true maritime power?
But I think here, again, when you look at Chinese naval capacities, clearly the center of gravity remains the Taiwan issue. And, indeed, since the Hu Jintao period, there are Chinese naval ambitions beyond East Asia. But the key center of gravity remains the capacity to interdict access to the Taiwan Strait to US forces in a situation or conflict, or deterring US naval forces from approaching the strait in a situation of conflict. So that's what matters most. And then what matters enormously as well is the capacity to mount an amphibious landing operation with the Navy that would involve the Navy. So I think that remains the top priority now. And the context is very interesting for China in relation to what has been happening in the Black Sea. We have seen the Russian Navy being completely incapable of mounting an amphibious landing operation on Odessa, and mines were sufficient to deter that operation in the early stages of the war. And you've seen also very successful Ukrainian operations using drones, using missiles on the Russian Black Sea fleet. So, I think the top concern of the Chinese when looking at the military balance in the Taiwan Straits, looking at the overall strategic picture with the US-Japan alliance in the region, is how to protect the Chinese fleet in a situation of conflict from being successfully targeted by those types of, military assets. So, observing the Chinese Navy in recent years, I think that's the issue that the Chinese leadership must consider as being the top strategic priority for changing the overall balance in East Asia.
And looking ahead, China moves into its 15th year, 5-year plan, and Beijing appears determined to accelerate its long-term military modernization. In this context, how do you think we should assess the pace and the depth of this innovation and modernization, and how is that going to change China's strategic foreign policy?
Yeah, I think, overall, especially when it comes to the Navy, the development has been remarkable. And the Chinese shipbuilding capacity, as we all know, is absolutely impressive and is actually listed by the Department of Defense in the US as one of the strong points of China's military development. I think looking ahead during the period of the 15th five-year plan, there's a very clear trajectory of additional capacity being commissioned in the Navy, trying to remove the weak points of the Chinese Navy. And what I would like to point out here is, two things. We've heard a lot about 2027 being the year of all dangers, because that's the 100th anniversary of the People's Liberation Army, and Xi Jinping has explicitly asked the PLA to be ready to win a war in the Taiwan Strait, right? So the people call that the Davidson window, because the US Admiral Davidson mentioned that this was a particularly dangerous year. But I think the Chinese timeline regarding using force in the region is clearly not aligned on this date. I think there are other considerations to include in the thinking regarding how they will approach the use of force. And the top one that comes to mind is just the political leadership of the PLA. And what we've been observing with the purges suggests that there are, in fact, pockets of opposition to the Xi agenda within the PLA, because of course there is corruption, and we have new data on corruption inside the PLA continuously, right? There's always new information. But what we've seen cannot only be explained by corruption. There are also political tensions, and there is the reconstruction of a loyal chain of command, and no one knows how long it will last. But I think it's quite remarkable to come to terms with the fact that loyalty and chain of command are still issues more than 10 years after the beginning of the Xi Jinping era.
Finally, I'd like to move to a broader diplomatic discussion. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, this year, China presented itself as a source of stability with the Vice Premier He Lifeng in a fragmented world economy, emphasizing multilateralism, commitment to globalization, and openness to trade. How do you read into that message from Beijing?
Well, to me, the message is principally tactical. I think it's mainly about exploiting the mistakes of the US administration to win support. I think the strategic framing coming from Beijing is very binary and simple, which doesn't mean that it's not smart. It is actually smart because it's convincing some leaders or some, opinion leaders, media, that China is an alternative to the instability and the unpredictability that is coming from the Trump administration on the trade agenda. But I think this message is first and foremost a diplomatic posture that does not really reflect a commitment to openness or trade, multilateralism. I think it's just, Chinese trade and economic interest finding a way or trying to find a path in capitals that are reconsidering the future of their relationship to the US because they have faced tariffs and other, when it comes to East Asian states, for example, requests to invest massively in the United States in ways that are bordering coercion. So that's a Chinese offer that is in fact a counter offer to what the US has been doing under the Trump administration. But we've seen this before, very honestly. We've seen this during the first Trump administration, and Xi Jinping himself was in Davos, and there was also a message on multilateralism, China as an anchor of stability in international relations, a key supporter of open trade. And I think that this time, my impression, at least in Europe, is that European leaders are not really taking the bait because they see that their trade problem with China is actually quite structural. So I think this message is not really resonating with European leaders.
Do you think that there is any Eurocentric narrative that is holding back the EU into building a stronger and more sustainable relationship with China?
Well, I don't really see it that way. I think, if you frame this question as values versus interests, I think that indeed there has been for quite some time a Eurocentric, that's the word you used, kind of narrative on values and this kind of idea that we should be able to, through engagement, to change China into a liberal democracy. But this has kind of disappeared from the strategic thinkers in Europe. I think, it's no longer there. It's not part of the policy. Now, the whole Europe, actually, EU level member states are speaking the language of interest. And so, by definition, European interest will be Eurocentric. So when you kind of go around the question of values, our democratic systems versus the Chinese system, and when we stopped, actually, because we did stop, try to promote democracy in China or liberalism in China, and refocused on the question of protecting our democracies from authoritarian influence, I think this kind of Eurocentric problem kind of disappears from the whole equation.
Thank you. Last but not least, entering in 2026, do you see EU member states strengthening dialogue and cooperation with China?
Well, I think when Macron went to China in 2023 and Scholz also restarted state visits to China or high-level diplomacy with China after COVID, I think there was a lot of skepticism in Europe regarding engagement with China. When the top leadership tried to restart top-level engagement, there was a lot of criticism focusing on the lack of actual deliverables. Now, in 2026, I do think that engagement with China is renormalized. It's normal. I think it's normal for political leaders to try and consult with their counterparts in Beijing. I do also think that there is a need for bridging the huge gap that has widened during COVID between, not only political leaders but also societies, because there has been a long period of time without any major, overall people-to-people relations have decreased, and many Europeans have left China during that period of time. And I think what has changed is that China has realized that this was highly problematic, actually. And you can see that China is trying to restart this people-to-people relationship with Europe, that it is open to dialogue. But I would stick to my kind of main point of analysis. I think that from a Chinese strategic perspective, people-to-people exchanges, top-level consultations with European leaders serve the goal of preserving the status quo in EU-China relations, because from China's perspective, this status quo is highly beneficial.
Thank you, Mathieu Duchâtel, for this engaging conversation, and thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.